This is the news in brief from the United Nations. In Ukraine, the UN chief Antonio Guterres said that large-scale strikes by Russia on the capital Kyiv and other locations on Monday were deeply shocking and represented another unacceptable escalation. The strikes, which have reportedly caused widespread damage to civilian areas and led to dozens of deaths and injuries, showed that once again civilians were paying the highest price for Russia's invasion in February, he added. Speaking in Geneva, Filippo Grandi, head of UN refugee agency UNHCR, reported that Kyiv, Dnipro, Lviv, Zaporizhzhia, Chernihiv and Odessa were among those hit in the latest uptick in violence after a key bridge that connects Russian-occupied Crimea and Russia was seriously damaged in an attack. This was another day of anguish for Ukrainian people, the High Commissioner for Refugees said. Mr. Grandi also noted that the situation across the war-torn country remains deeply concerning. At least 6.2 million people are internally displaced and many more need humanitarian support, he told a meeting of UNHCR's Executive Committee. With winter fast approaching and millions of Ukrainians, especially the aged and disabled, counting on all of us, the UN Refugee Agency head cautioned that there were limits to what humanitarians can do. Heat waves already kill thousands of people every year, and they could overwhelm the world's aid response unless action is taken to mitigate climate change, the UN's emergency relief chief said on Monday. Without immediate financial help for the most vulnerable communities, the world is destined for a future of ever larger and deadlier heat disasters, Martin Griffiths told journalists in Geneva.
The humanitarian system is not equipped to handle crises of this scale on our own. To avoid a future of recurrent heat disasters, we need massive and targeted investments, especially for the most vulnerable, and we need that now.
Mr. Griffiths was speaking at the launch of a report published jointly by the UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, OCHA, and the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies. It details recommendations and best practice from developing countries that have put in place measures to support long-term adaptation to climate change. According to the report, the European heatwave of 2003 was responsible for more than 70,000 deaths, beyond what would normally have been expected. The Russian heatwave of 2010 killed over 55,000 people, it also noted. Top independent rights experts appointed by the Human Rights Council called on Monday for the immediate release of Ales Bialiatski following the Nobel Committee's decision last week to award him the 2022 Nobel Peace Prize. Mr. Bialiatski founded the Belarus human rights group Vyazna in 1996. He was first detained in 2011 and then sentenced to 12 years detention in 2021. Several of Mr. Bialiatski's colleagues remain behind bars. In a statement, the experts, who include Anais Marin, Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in Belarus, maintained that there was a serious accountability gap for gross violations of human rights law in Belarus. Long prison sentences handed down to human rights defenders are emblematic of the abuse of the justice system and the impunity that Belarusian authorities enjoy, the experts continued. Daniel Johnson, UN News. This is the news in brief from the United Nations. In Ukraine, at least 12 civilians were killed and more than 100 injured in Monday morning's wave of missile attacks by Russian forces, the UN Human Rights Office OHCHR has said. Cities hit included Kyiv, Dnipro and Zaporizhzhia, the strikes happening as people were going to work and taking children to school. OHCHR spokesperson Ravina Shamdasani said that dozens of residential buildings had been damaged or destroyed, along with at least 12 energy facilities in 8 regions.
Attacks targeting civilians and objects indispensable to the survival of civilians are prohibited under international humanitarian law. We urge the Russian Federation to refrain from further escalation.
Attacks on civilian infrastructure may be a violation of internationally agreed rules of war, Ms. Shamdasani told journalists in Geneva. She said that damage to key power stations and power lines as winter approaches raises further concerns for the protection of civilians, before urging Russia to take all feasible measures to prevent civilian casualties and damage to civilian infrastructure. An alert now from the Democratic Republic of the Congo, or DRC, where more than 140 people have been killed in intercommunal violence in the far west of the country. The UN Refugee Agency, UNHCR, said that thousands have been displaced since July in Kwamel, near the border with the Republic of Congo. Clashes over land taxes between the Teke and Yaka communities reportedly resulted in victims being beheaded. Many had to leave their farms and abandon their harvests and walk for days to reach Bandundu town, 245 kilometres or 152 miles away. Aid teams who've reached displaced communities report that people have had to flee for their lives, seeking safety in the forest. Latest data indicates that 27,000, mainly women and children, have been displaced, and they need urgent assistance in Kwilu and Mai-Ndombe provinces. Another 2,600 people have sought refuge in the Republic of Congo after crossing the Congo River in canoes. Many have become separated from family members while fleeing for safety. An urgent appeal now from the UN Weather Agency, WMO, to governments everywhere to switch to cleaner forms of energy such as solar, wind and hydroelectric power. According to the World Meteorological Organization, the supply of electricity from clean energy sources needs to double within the next 8 years if we're to limit global temperature increase. The problem is that energy demand has increased 30% in the last decade alone. Without strong measures, there is a risk that climate change, more extreme weather and water stress will undermine our energy security and jeopardize renewable energy supplies, the WMO said in its State of Climate report. Today, 85% of the energy we produce comes from fossil fuels and only 15% comes from nuclear and renewables. Time is not on our side and our climate is changing before our eyes, said WMO Secretary-General Petteri Talas, who called for a complete transformation of the global energy system. Daniel Johnson, UN News.
This is the news in brief from the United Nations. Finland violated the rights of its own child citizens detained in camps in northern Syria by failing to repatriate them, a UN expert committee said on Wednesday. The decision by the Child Rights Committee follows a case filed by the relatives of 6 Finnish children held at the Al-Hol camp in life-threatening conditions. The children were born in Syria and their parents had allegedly collaborated with the Daesh terrorist group, also known as ISIL. The UN committee found that Finland has the responsibility and power to protect the children and to repatriate them. The case was brought to the committee in 2019. Since then, 3 of the children left the camp with their mother and eventually arrived in Finland. The committee has urged Finland to take urgent action to repatriate the 3 remaining children, who are between 5 and 6 years old. A new framework launched on Wednesday by the World Health Organization, WHO, aims to boost action towards ending tuberculosis or TB, the world's top infectious killer. Each year, 10 million people fall ill with the bacterial disease, which mainly affects the lungs. Although TB is preventable and curable, 1.5 million people die from it annually. The WHO framework recognizes that addressing health-related risk factors and comorbidities among people with TB is essential to end the epidemic. It outlines steps to strengthen collaboration to support countries to increase access to high-quality prevention and care. 5 key risk factors are driving TB, WHO said: alcohol use disorder, diabetes, HIV, smoking, and undernutrition. These factors accounted for an alarming 45% of TB episodes in 2020. People with TB can also experience mental health disorders, drug use disorders, and viral hepatitis, which can lead to poorer treatment outcomes and lowered quality of life. The spiraling cost of living, fallout from the COVID-19 pandemic, and high unemployment rates have made it difficult for many Venezuelan refugees and migrants across Latin America and the Caribbean to rebuild their lives and integrate into society. Some 4.3 million are facing challenges when it comes to accessing food, housing, and stable jobs, according to a report by the UN Refugee Agency, UNHCR, the UN Migration Agency, IOM, and partners. There are more than 7 million Venezuelan refugees and migrants worldwide, with most, 80%, living in 17 countries in Latin America and the Caribbean. The study found that half of those in the region cannot afford 3 meals a day and lack access to safe housing. Many are resorting to survival sex, begging, or indebtedness just to get something to eat or to avoid living on the streets. The study calls on the international community not to forget about these people and the communities hosting them. Deanne Penn, UN News.
This is the news in brief from the United Nations. A new report from the UN Office for Disaster Risk Reduction and the UN Weather Agency, WMO, published on Thursday, warns that half of the world's countries are not protected by multi-hazard early warning systems. Coinciding with the International Day for Disaster Risk Reduction, the numbers are worst of all for developing countries on the front lines of climate change. Less than half of the least developed countries and only a third of small island developing states have adequate early warning systems in place. The report's based on new data that shows countries with limited coverage have mortality rates during disasters that are 8 times higher than those with substantial to comprehensive coverage. The world is failing to invest in protecting the lives and livelihoods of those on the front line, said UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres. The world's at risk of yet another year of record hunger as the global food crisis continues to drive more people into worsening levels of acute food insecurity, the World Food Programme, WFP, warned on Thursday. In a call for urgent action to address the root causes of rising hunger ahead of World Food Day, the agency said the current crisis was down to a confluence of competing crises caused by climate shocks, conflict and economic instability. The number of hungry people around the world has shot up from 282 million to around 345 million since the beginning of 2022, and by mid-year WFP had reached just over 111 million in need, aiming to reach a record 153 million by year's end. WFP chief David Beasley said things can and will get worse unless there is a large-scale and coordinated effort to address the root causes of this crisis. And finally, more than 30 trade unions and other worker representatives from 10 countries across Southeast Asia have pledged to push for a more sustainable and fairer economy across the vast region that enables decent work for all. Meeting in the Philippines earlier this week, the conference marked the first face-to-face meeting of the group since the COVID-19 pandemic began, focused on strategies for resilience and recovery moving forward. The countries represented were Cambodia, Indonesia, Laos, Malaysia, Myanmar, Philippines, Singapore, Thailand, Timor-Leste and Vietnam. In a joint conclusion declaration, representatives charted and identified ways in which they could all collaborate to tackle growing inequalities and violations of workers' rights. Matt Wells, UN News. This is the news in brief from the United Nations. An unrelenting series of crises has trapped vulnerable Haitians in a cycle of growing desperation. Without access to food, fuel, markets, jobs and public services, the Food and Agriculture Organization, FAO, and the World Food Programme, WFP, warned on Friday. For the first time ever in Haiti, around 19,000 people are living with catastrophic level 5 hunger on the Integrated Food Security Phase Classification Index, or IPC, in the capital Cité Soleil neighbourhood. A record 4.7 million people are currently facing acute hunger, including 1.8 million in emergency phase IPC4. Currently, 65% of Cité Soleil's population, especially the poorest and most vulnerable, face high levels of food insecurity, with 5% of them in urgent need of aid. Increased violence with armed groups vying for control of the vast and now lawless area of Port-au-Prince has meant that residents have lost access to their work, markets and health and nutrition services. Many have been forced to flee or just hide indoors. The Secretary-General Antonio Guterres has welcomed the announcement by the Lebanese and Israeli governments of an historic settlement of their maritime border dispute. The agreement brokered by the United States is being seen as a major breakthrough in relations between the neighbouring countries, who've formerly been at war since the foundation of Israel in 1948. Mr. Guterres said that he strongly believes this encouraging development can promote increased stability in the region and increase prosperity for Israelis and Lebanese alike. He said the UN remains committed to assisting both countries as requested. Under the deal, Lebanon reportedly regains around 860 square kilometres of disputed maritime territory in the Mediterranean that's home to offshore gas fields. And finally, in the face of the growing hunger crisis, the head of the UN Food and Agriculture Organization stressed the need to harness the power of solidarity and collective action to build a sustainable world with enough to eat for everyone. Director General Ku Dong-yu led a celebration marking Sunday's World Food Day at FAO headquarters in Rome, declaring that with food security worsening, the world must leave no one behind. In a special message to the event, Secretary-General Guterres said it was taking place at a challenging moment for everyone's food security. Together we must move from despair to hope and action, he said. On World Food Day and every day, I call on you to be part of the change. Matt Wells, UN News.